Story number 1.
The Echoing Woods. It was supposed to be a fun weekend. A group of 5 friends, Emma, Jake, Lisa, Ben, and Sarah, had planned a camping trip deep in the woods. They wanted to disconnect from their phones, enjoy nature, and tell spooky stories around the campfire. The woods they chose were far from any major roads, surrounded by legends of strange disappearances. Locals called it the Echoing Woods because of an eerie phenomenon. Sounds carried in odd, unnatural ways, often repeating themselves. "Just a myth to scare people," Jake said as they set up camp. "It's probably the wind or something." The others laughed nervously, but Emma couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The first night went smoothly. They roasted marshmallows, shared laughs, and told ghost stories. Jake, always the joker, banged a pot behind Lisa during one particularly tense moment, making her scream and everyone else burst into laughter. But later, as they lay in their tents, Emma heard something. A faint sound like whispering carried on the breeze. "Jake?" she called out softly, thinking it was another one of his pranks. No response. The whispering grew louder, and Emma sat up, her heart pounding. "Do you hear that?" she asked Sarah, who was in the tent with her. Sarah groggily muttered, "It's just the wind. Go to sleep." But Emma wasn't so sure. The next morning, Jake was unusually quiet. "What's wrong?" Lisa asked as they prepared breakfast. Jake shook his head. "I thought I heard someone outside my tent last night, but when I checked, no one was there." Emma's stomach twisted. "I heard whispering, like voices." Ben laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "You guys are letting the spooky stories get to you. It's just the woods. They're full of sounds." Still, an unspoken tension lingered as they spent the day hiking and exploring. That night the unease returned. The wind howled through the trees and the campfire seemed to flicker more than it should. They sat in a circle, trying to ignore the oppressive silence of the woods. Suddenly, a voice called out from the darkness, "Help me!" They froze. It was faint, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, desperate and pleading. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered. Ben stood, shining his flashlight into the trees. "Hello? Is someone there?" The voice echoed again, slightly closer. "Help me." Against their better judgment, they followed the sound. The flashlight beams danced across the trees as they ventured deeper into the woods. The voice grew louder, but it never seemed to stay in one place. "This is a bad idea," Emma said, her voice shaking. Jake nodded. "We should go back to camp." But just as they turned to leave, the voice called out again, directly behind them. "Help me!" They spun around, the flashlight illuminating nothing but trees. "Who's there?" Ben shouted. Silence. Then, they heard footsteps, fast, heavy footsteps running toward them. Panic set in as they bolted back to the campsite. When they arrived, the fire was out and their tents were slashed open. "What the hell?" Jake yelled, his voice cracking. "We have to leave," Emma said, her eyes darting around. "Now." They grabbed what they could and started toward the trail, but the path seemed different, unfamiliar. The trees seemed to close in around them, and no matter which direction they turned, they ended up back at the campsite. "We're going in circles," Lisa cried, tears streaming down her face. And then they heard it again. "Help me." The voice was louder, closer, and no longer pleading. It sounded wrong. The air grew colder, and the shadows of the trees seemed to move. Jake shined his flashlight around frantically, the beam catching something just out of reach. A figure stood at the edge of the light, a woman, pale and gaunt, her hair matted and her eyes wide and empty. "Help me," she said, but her lips didn't move. Emma screamed, and the figure lunged forward, disappearing as the flashlight flickered out. Chaos erupted as they ran in all directions, each calling out for one another. Emma tripped and fell, scraping her hands on the rough ground. She scrambled to her feet, but the whispers surrounded her, growing louder and more frantic. "Help me, help me, help me." By morning, only Emma made it out of the woods. She stumbled onto the roadside, her clothes torn and her face pale. A passing driver stopped and called for help. When the police arrived, she could only mutter, "The voices. They took them. Search parties combed the area for weeks, but found no trace of the others. To this day, hikers in the echoing woods report hearing voices, pleading, desperate calls for help. And sometimes, if they venture too far off the trail, they never come back.
Story number 2.
The last room on the left, Victor had been a traveling salesman for most of his adult life. Over the years, he'd stayed in countless motels, most of them forgettable, some barely habitable. But the Cloverfield Inn was different. It wasn't flashy, just a quaint building off a quiet highway, but it had a strange charm. The receptionist, an older woman with a kind smile, handed him the key to room 203 and said, almost casually, "Stay clear of the last room on the left." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Why?" She hesitated, then gave a nervous chuckle. "Just maintenance issues. Enjoy your stay." Victor shrugged it off. Room 203 was clean, with a comfortable bed and a decent view of the highway. It was better than most places he'd stayed. He unpacked, took a quick shower, and decided to grab a snack from the vending machine down the hall. As he walked past the row of doors, he couldn't help but notice the last room on the left, room 209. The door looked perfectly normal except for a faint scratch mark near the handle. Victor paused, curious, but kept moving. That night, as he lay in bed flipping through channels, he heard something faint, a knocking sound. At first he thought it was coming from another room, but then it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the direction of room 209. He muted the TV and sat up, listening intently. Knock, knock, knock. It was slow and deliberate, as if someone was waiting for an answer. He shook his head, chuckling nervously. Probably just the pipes or something. But then he heard a faint voice. "Let me in." Victor's chest tightened. He grabbed the remote and turned the TV back on, trying to drown out the noise. But the knocking didn't stop. He debated calling the front desk, but decided against it. Instead, he grabbed his phone and walked into the hallway, hoping to convince himself it was nothing. The corridor was empty, bathed in dim yellow light. The knocking was louder out here, echoing off the walls. Victor approached room 209, his curiosity battling his unease. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the doorknob began to turn. Victor stepped back, his pulse racing. The door creaked open, just an inch, revealing only darkness beyond. "Hello?" he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. No response. He inched closer, peering into the gap. A sudden icy draft hit him, making him shiver. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic, like blood. Suddenly the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Victor stumbled back, his heart pounding. The hallway was silent again, but he wasn't about to stick around. Back in his room, Victor locked the door and tried to calm down. He told himself it was just his imagination, but sleep didn't come easily. When he finally drifted off, he was jolted awake by a loud thud. It sounded like it came from above him. He stared at the ceiling, his breath shallow as the thudding continued, moving across the room. Then a whisper. "Come see." The voice was right outside his door. Victor grabbed the phone and called the front desk. The same older woman answered. "Someone's messing around in the hallway near room 209, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. There was a long pause. "Sir," she said quietly, "there's no one in that room. There hasn't been for years." Victor froze. "What do you mean?" She sighed. "It's an old story. A guest died there, under strange circumstances. We keep it closed off, but sometimes things happen." The line went dead. Victor didn't wait for morning. He packed his bag and headed to the front desk to check out. The lobby was empty, the receptionist nowhere to be seen. On the counter was an old guest book. Curious, he flipped through the pages. Names, dates, and room numbers filled the columns, until he reached a page marked with a single entry in shaky handwriting. It read, "Victor Thomas. Room 209. His blood ran cold. That wasn't the room he was given. He bolted out of the motel, driving through the night without looking back, Later, when he tried to find the Cloverfield Inn again, it was gone. The lot where it had stood was empty, overgrown with weeds, as if it had never been there at all.
Story number 3.
The Forgotten Playroom. Maria was thrilled when her family moved into the sprawling Victorian house on the edge of town. It was the kind of home she'd always dreamed of: high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and a sprawling backyard. But what captivated her most was the small locked door in the basement. Probably just an old storage room, her husband Mark said as he unpacked boxes, but Maria was curious. The door was heavy, its paint chipped, and its brass doorknob tarnished with age. She felt an odd pull toward it, an unexplainable urge to see what lay behind. "Let's leave it alone for now," Mark suggested. But for now didn't last long. One afternoon, while Mark was at work, Maria decided to investigate. The key had been tucked into a drawer in the kitchen, likely left by the previous owners. With trembling hands, she inserted it into the lock. The door creaked open to reveal a small, dusty room. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mildew. Sunlight streamed through a single dirt-streaked window, illuminating a collection of antique toys. A rocking horse with peeling paint, a dollhouse with broken shutters, and a stack of wooden blocks arranged in haphazard piles. But what caught her eye was the large mirror on the far wall. It was tall, its frame ornate and gilded, though tarnished with age. The glass was cloudy, but Maria could still make out her reflection. "Creepy," she muttered, stepping closer. Over the next few days, Maria couldn't stop thinking about the playroom. She spent hours down there cleaning and arranging the toys. The more time she spent in the room, the more she noticed peculiar things. The mirror, for one, seemed to change. Shadows moved behind the glass, fleeting and subtle, as if something was watching her. Once, as she adjusted the rocking horse, she thought she saw a figure in the reflection, small, childlike. But when she turned around, the room was empty. "Just my imagination," she told herself. But the unease lingered. One night, Maria awoke to the faint sound of laughter. It was high-pitched, childlike, and seemed to be coming from the basement. She nudged Mark awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned. "Probably the wind. Go back to sleep." But Maria couldn't. She grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs. The basement was silent, the playroom door slightly ajar. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The toys were exactly where she'd left them. But the mirror was different. It was no longer cloudy, but clear, almost unnaturally so. The reflection showed the room as it was, except for one detail. A child stood in the middle of the room, staring directly at her. Maria froze. The child was a little girl, dressed in an old-fashioned frock, her hair in loose curls. "Who are you?" Maria whispered, her voice trembling. The girl didn't respond. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward the dollhouse. Maria's flashlight flickered, and a chill swept through the room. "Mommy?" the girl said, her voice faint and distorted. Maria's heart pounded as she backed toward the door, but before she could leave, the girl stepped forward, still inside the mirror. "Don't leave me," the girl pleaded, her face twisting in sorrow. The next morning, Maria told Mark everything. "You're just stressed," he said, brushing it off. "This house is old. It's probably messing with your head." But Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She avoided the playroom for days, but the laughter continued at night. And then the dreams started. In her dreams, Maria was standing in the playroom, surrounded by children. They whispered to her, their faces blurred, their hands cold as they tugged at her arms. "Stay with us," they begged. One night, Maria woke to find the playroom door wide open. She knew she had locked it. Against her better judgment, she went downstairs. The room was alive with movement. The rocking horse swayed gently. The dollhouse lights flickered, and the mirror glowed faintly. The girl was there, standing in front of the mirror, her eyes fixed on Maria. "Please," the girl said, tears streaming down her face. "Help us." Maria stepped closer, unable to resist. Her reflection in the mirror was gone, replaced by the girl's tearful expression. "Help you how?" Maria whispered. The girl pointed again, this time to the blocks. Maria knelt, moving the wooden pieces aside. Beneath them was a trapdoor. Inside the trapdoor was a small box. Maria opened it with trembling hands to find faded photographs, old toys, and a stack of newspaper clippings. One headline read, "Local Children Missing in Tragic Fire." The article detailed a fire that had consumed a local orphanage over a century ago. The building had stood on the very spot where Maria's house now sat. The children's bodies had never been found. The girl in the mirror began to fade, her expression softening. "Thank you," she whispered, before disappearing completely. The playroom door never opened again. Maria and Mark moved out a few months later, unable to ignore the lingering chills that filled the house. To this day, Maria wonders if the children were finally at peace, or if they were still waiting for someone else to hear their cries.